Bring your cup and take a seat. Fill it up, coffee, wine, or tea. Come find what you're looking for. A good pour.
Welcome back to A Good Pour in our series on a summer of good AI. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Victoria Livingstone, a writer and editor who taught writing for almost 20 years before quitting in 2024, largely because of ChatGPT. She wrote about that decision in a Time article, I Quit Teaching Because of ChatGPT, and it went viral. She's now managing editor of an academic journal at Johns Hopkins and writes a Substack called Human Generated about writing, motherhood, and AI. We get into what it means for writing to be a form of thinking, not just a way to get thoughts out of your head. Here's my conversation with Victoria Livingstone. So I want to dive right into the article, mainly because it was published in September 30th, 2024. This is about 2 years after ChatGPT was released. So it's pretty, new in the process, of course, of, it was a year really, right? Like, so you quit teaching within a year of ChatGPT really becoming mainstream and wrote this article that went viral. And I'd love for you to just talk about what led you to write this article and really change your profession. You're a writer, but you stopped teaching. And then I'd love to know what's going through your head, because a lot's changed even since 2024, of course. So just walk me through that.
Yeah, a lot has changed. I know the models have evolved a lot, and it's just with that article, I think one of the reasons it went so viral is because I was just a little bit ahead of the curve and essentially saying that the emperor has no clothes, and say because there was and still is a lot of hype around AI. It's a very polarizing topic, as I'm sure you know, too. And there was also a lot of, panels on pedagogy at conferences on how to incorporate AI and best practices, where really I felt that, I'd been teaching a long time. I knew the best pedagogical best practices. I tried all kinds of things, and it just did not matter. Students are going to, what I felt, outsource thinking to AI. There's very little way to control that unless you resort to, I know a lot of professors have gone back to in-class writing with those old blue books, and then you can do it with oral checks, basically, but that's very difficult to do if you're an instructor teaching 100 students a semester and, teaching 4 sections of writing classes at 25 students each. It's nearly impossible. And in fact, yesterday I was with some former colleagues. I used to teach at New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark. That was the last teaching job I had. So I was talking to my colleagues who still teach there, and they were saying one of them had said he teaches a class on literary representations of monsters, and he'd given an assignment that was very creative, sort of write and something along the lines of describe a monster, and something very creative and very open. And even that he said, was outsourced to AI by a lot of students. And he got a lot of the same kinds of descriptions from students. So yeah, it has evolved. And I, yeah. And for me, it obviously wasn't, AI was not the only reason I stopped teaching. I also got a very attractive job offer to be an editor for Johns Hopkins, which is where I am now. And so there were several different factors, but AI really
Sure.
was the last straw, because I was teaching writing, and I just found my students plugging things into AI, no matter, even if I did exercises with them on craft awareness. And I was teaching a lot of PhD students in STEM who were well aware of the limitations and capabilities of large language models. Some of them had a deeper understanding than I do because they were computer scientists, or they really had a good understanding of the mechanisms of the models, and they still were just plugging things into AI. And I just, as I'd said in the article, did not want to spend my career either playing detective or giving feedback to a computer. I didn't want to do it
Machine.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the article had a huge response. Did the response surprise you? And has it since then, have you experienced that kind of polarizing response that, I mean, that I'm seeing a lot, especially on this topic?
Actually, I think at that time, the most I would say, I'm really estimating here, but I would say maybe 85, 80 to 85% of the responses I got were from educators who were just similarly despairing, saying yes, and basically the emperor has no clothes, and this is how we feel too. And then I got some response from people in tech who were saying, I've designed this model or I've designed that helps with critical thinking. And then I also was contacted by the CEO of a big tech company who spent an hour with me discussing tech as a democratizing or as a leveling factor used in schools, and yeah, which I wasn't convinced by, and then told me that there are products, AI products, or this company has products in 90% of school districts in the country. I see it also. This is related but off topic from my Time articles. I have a daughter who just finished kindergarten, and so I can already see, she hasn't had exposure to AI, but even they're using Chromebooks in kindergarten, and she comes back saying this, they're doing this online assessment, and so they have to be online to do this, and all of that. It makes me crazy watching it, and a young child too.
Well, I have a freshman well, he just finished his freshman year of college. And then I have she'll be a senior. She actually wants to be an early childhood educator, kindergarten, most likely teacher. And I can tell you my story with AI. For me as a marketer, I own a marketing agency. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh, we're going to have to shift, or I'm going to, this is going to totally change the marketing world. And it has, but so I've leaned into it and I've learned it. And I'm trying to decide, and this is kind of that tension in this topic, because we have to really know the good and the bad. And so that's really why I'm trying to have conversations with people like you, because it's changing my world. It's already changed my world, but there's got to be a line, kind of this right and wrong. But, Caleb, my son, has done a whole lot of writing with, there's very little computers in the classroom right now. And I'm guessing that is because of this, knowing knowing that the students are not using AI, right? But then, everything we're hearing is that they're going to need to know AI as soon as they graduate, right? And so it's this. And then my daughter, she wants to be an educator, and so we're looking at colleges of education, and I'm asking questions like, do you see education changing? And they'll say yes for a variety of reasons, not just AI, but we're not really tackling the subject. So, I mean, I love the fact that you have a 6-year-old and you're seeing this, but you've also been at the higher level education. So where do we go, Victoria?
I do think that there, at least I will say in the school district where I am in New Jersey, at a orientation for incoming first graders, which is where my daughter is, it did seem that that the tide is turning a bit, whereas less than a generation ago with the pandemic, the conversation was very much a laptop for every child, let's get tech into schools. And now I think that my impression is that there is broader recognition that that was an overcorrection, and that we don't, yeah, that a certain amount of tech in schools is damaging. And the general impression I got, even from parents who are not educators, based on this conversation at my daughter's first grade orientation, was that a lot of parents want, don't let them bring the Chromebooks home from school. Why are we doing so much online on the computers, especially with young children? And I know there's been a push too locally to not in my school district, but to get AI out of elementary school. And I do think when you said that the conversation is polarized, it totally is. And I do think that there needs to be more room for nuance around AI and many other topics also. But my concern as an educator was that to me, writing is very closely connected to thinking. And when you're using AI to even, even when people say I used it to write an outline or to help generate ideas, it seems to me very insidious and that you're not fully aware necessarily of how much you're outsourcing your thinking the moment you start to do that. Because to me, writing an outline or thinking of ways to make your ideas cohere, that is part of writing. And those are the points of friction that AI provides a very easy, comfortable off-ramp for. And when people aren't doing that, then my concern is that people will stop developing those skills, and that's a big problem.
So you've said this a lot that in my research of you is, that writing is that process of thinking. It's not just the actual output of what you created or what you wrote. It is the thought process and the outline even in your head of what you're going to write. So when you think of this, and a lot of times I work with a lot of businesses and they're just like, well, I just need to get the email out, or I need to do this quickly. And so is there a place in your mind for AI in any sort of writing, or is this, what's your line, I guess, in your mind?
I suppose if it's something very purely administrative, maybe writing an email, or even then, I don't ever use it in my writing at all, but I know I had colleagues where I was teaching before who, for example, needed to compile data on courses they were teaching, and they had pages and pages of assessment data, and they needed to put it into a one-page report, would use AI for that. That doesn't seem quite as problematic to me, but beyond those sort of administrative tasks, I would not use it. I also feel a little bit protected from it because I, you know, I am a writer and I do not use it at all, but I also don't work in the corporate world or the marketing world. And I know that
Sure.
there there is possibly most likely greater pressure for, what is cost effective and what is quick. And in
Right.
fact, after that viral article, I had somebody tell me that that I would be a person who is well positioned to use AI because I'm good at evaluating writing. I can make a living to some extent off of my writing. And this person was saying I should really use it because I also, I'm a single mother. I need to supplement my income. Why wouldn't I use AI to basically produce more content? And to me, that thought is just sort of horrifying because I don't see my job as a writer to just flood the market with
Get
content.
more out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, which is what I mean. I was just saying, I don't, you maybe haven't heard of this, but there's this Yapper challenge and this woman is selling it for like $297 or something. And she's made like $4.5 million on selling this program that starts like July 1st or something. And basically it's just encouraging people to get online with a microphone and yap or just talk about what they're talking about. And it's, to me, I mean, it's not writing and it's not really even using AI. It's the idea of storytelling and talking. But I'm going, we're just starved for conversation, evidently. Or, it's this, I mean, if she can make $4.5 million and counting on a program that's encouraging people to just get online and tell stories, like, what does that say about, where we are in society?
That's very interesting, actually. In early May, I was in a storytelling show that's a national thing, but I was in a local production that's called Listen to Your Mother, where it's storytelling about motherhood. And that
What's that?
that was a live storytelling show, and it was a very community focused event. It was very professionally done, but being there and feeling the difference of doing something that's live and feels very authentic, people telling personal stories live with a very warm audience. I was thinking a lot about how hungry people are for community, for in-person community connection. So yeah, that's interesting what you're saying about somebody.
Well, but I'm also wondering if, I mean, just as a marketer, I've really thought through this over the past, I don't know, 12 hours when I learned how much money I mean, how much,
Mm.
this significant amount of revenue for her. But it's also, if you spend any time on social media right now, it's very easy for marketers and people to produce content because they just go to an LLM and they'll say, write a post about this or, make a horrible looking graphic. I don't know if you've seen those
Yeah.
that are generated, from AI, but it's almost like we've lost. And I know you've spoken or written about this where even, national magazines are can clearly using AI for published material. And so almost in this, I don't know what's real and what's not. And so I think that speaks to, if somebody's going to get online and use a mic and speak, like it's more than likely them, it's real. And so there's a little bit of a trust gained there when we know that it's them, right? How often are you seeing like AI? You just clearly know it's AI in trusted sources that we would not assume that AI is being used.
I think it's getting more difficult to detect, and there have been some studies. I don't have the citation in front of me, but there was some linguistic study that looked at, linguists, so like people reviewing, I think they were reviewing academic articles about they were looking at their ability to distinguish AI generated and human authored text, and a lot of them, then I don't remember what the percentage was, but they got it wrong more than you would expect for somebody who's trained to look closely at language. I do think that AI generated writing is generally weak. And there are all those tells that we all know by now, the not X but Y and like the M dash and the triads. But it's really problematic because I actually have just been writing something for my Substack about the ways some of us might be inclined to modify our own writing in reaction to that. So those triad, those three-part structure, that's also a mark in many ways of good writing, because if you want to provide evidence for something, two examples is not quite enough. Three is stronger. Four starts to get clunky. So like there's a reason that AI models use things like that, those lists of threes, the rule of threes. But then when I find in my own writing, oh, I have these rules of three, should I edit that out? All of that sort of creeps me out because I think I'm not a machine. This is the way I write, but it's causing me to rethink some of my own writing habits. And like many writers, I would imagine many writers have done this, especially in the wake of the news of the New York Times Modern Love column running an article that was partly AI generated. They had a book reviewer too who ended up plagiarizing part of a book review that was in the Guardian because he had been using a large language model. I mean, there's been a lot of instances of this, and now some places are looking at running text through Pangram, through the AI detector. So I've put my own writing through Pangram just out of curiosity. What is it? And it always returns 100% human generated. But I'm sure there are other writers putting their own writing through the detectors to see what comes back.
I mean, I will write something and it's 100% me, and I will put it in one of those AI checkers, and it comes back as like 65% AI, and I'm going, what am I doing that makes it sound and look like AI? But that's when I teach on AI, I get that question a lot because you know teachers are having to spend time going in and trying to use these AI checkers that are AI, right? I mean, it's interesting, and the students will insist that they didn't use AI. And I've had some of my daughter's friends come and say, I swear I did not use AI, and but yet it's almost like the teacher is saying, well, yes you did, because I taking this one tool and judging your writing basically. And they're having to do, I mean, it's basically not just reading the work. Now you have to check it for AI, and then it's challenging the student, which can lead to they feel bad about themselves. You're basically calling them a cheater even though they're not. I mean, like, it's a disaster.
Yeah, it is. Actually, I have a niece who is about to start high school, and one of her teachers failed. She's very hardworking. She's very conscientious. She's a strong writer. One of her teachers failed her on assignment because he said she used AI, and she said, I did not, and I hate it so much. I hate AI. And then she ended up meeting with him, and he told her she should humanize her writing, which is just all of that concept, it's anyway, he ended up changing the grade, but it is problematic because I've heard a number of cases. Also with teaching, I did not I didn't want to spend my time being a detective, and it's also very hard to prove. I would not have relied on AI detectors to judge student work. So when I suspected something was AI generated, I would just first I would look at citations since I was teaching academic writing. If the citations were hallucinated, then that was a clear sign that there was AI involved. But if it wasn't, then I would just look for other ways to lower the grade, which is easy enough to do because AI doesn't tend to produce strong work anyway. But I did not spend my time trying to figure out whether work was AI generated or not. But now, I thought, I stopped teaching, 2 years ago, and now I'm an editor now at Johns Hopkins. I manage an academic journal, and we have mostly been pretty protected. We don't see very many AI generated submissions, and I've just written something about this too that may end up in my Substack, which is called Human Generated. But I think to some extent, humanities journals are somewhat protected so far from AI use because humanities scholars are among those most resistant to AI use. Our work is also the nature of our work is reading and writing, and most people don't want to outsource that. So the articles we get that seem likely to have AI use are immediate rejections for other reasons. They don't fit at all with what we publish. They're weak in other ways. But we had one recently that we're not quite sure, and we put it through review. And now we're looking at things like how quickly did this author revise? I want to look at the track changes in the article to see whether the changes look like somebody actually made edits or they were just blocks of text that he possibly outsourced to AI and inserted. So I'm sure it will increasingly be a problem in every field. I know journals in STEM and in social sciences are already inundated with AI generated submissions. In my field, less, but I think it's coming. It's also a financial problem because for publishers, these RAG models, when you ask AI a question and it's giving you an answer based on, say, content that Johns Hopkins publishes or other publishers are publishing, but you don't actually go to the source, then it's also a financial problem for the publishers because their model depends on people reading the articles, not just reading an AI summary. So I'm sure I would imagine in your field or in marketing, you probably feel the effects more quickly than in
Well,
mine.
it became very easy for people, to write blogs, for example, or they had AI write them. And so instead of, we have a process, we'll interview a small business owner and about their expertise and about, what they're trying to solve or how they're trying to help people. And so they will use their voice because a lot of times, somebody's doing a marketing agency or using a marketing agency because they're not good at marketing, right? Like I might hire a writer because I'm not good at writing. I'm perfectly fine at writing, but we're leaning on experts when we need something, and so AI makes us all feel like experts, and so they can just say, I want to, instead of it using their own voice and we write it, then they can just kind of type or speak to AI, and then the AI writes the blog very easily. But it's not for the most part, unless they are taking the time. In one of your articles, I just love that you said this. I'm gonna find it really quick. It said, I cannot access the messiness of our memories nor determine the ways in which those memories are filtered through our current experience. And yes, AI might be able to write an article on, you know, how a small business can, or if it's a dentist, right? Like these are the things that you need to do to take care of your teeth, but it can't tell the stories of the patients that they've been interacting with, and it can't say in my experience. Yes, you can tell the AI that, right? But it doesn't know that unless you tell it. My concern, I think, is just that we're losing those stories that go along with it, because it's not just the knowledge that we need or the expertise that we need. We need the stories that go along with it. That's what makes life interesting, right?
Yeah, and yeah, I agree with that completely. And it's not, to me, it's not just a personal experience. It's that sometimes, and again, for me, writing is very much a process of thinking, and I see it as a sort of process of excavation. Sometimes as I start writing, my ideas change or memories surface. Yeah, and this way too, I find AI kind of insidious, because if I ask it to, write an article on freelance writing or whatever it is, and it will, I might start with an idea, and I might sometimes start writing an article thinking I have a certain conclusion or a certain direction that I want the article to go. When I'm writing, often, actually most of the time, the project transforms as I write. So even what I thought was going to be my main takeaway might really change in the process of writing. And that's not the case if you're just outsourcing something to AI. And I think you're losing the moments there where you have the ability for that sort of revelation, for the process of discovery that happens with writing. And I think that people who, especially students or younger people who don't have the experience that you have or that I have, and working through these ideas and getting into that messy and often uncomfortable territory, they don't necessarily know what they're missing. They're just outsourcing all of that. And that to me is a big loss.
And will have consequences
Yeah.
for themselves and society. So, part of what I'm kind of wrestling with is the idea of ethical AI, or having some sort of lines. In our school systems, there's guidance that we should be teaching students ethical AI, but one, who has defined what ethical AI is, and who is teaching our teachers what that is, right? And so I just came up with a framework. It's called Create, and if you're going to use it, like C stands for credit. So let's say that I used AI instead of it just becoming. It's very easy to have a great idea and have gotten it on AI, right? And then claim it as your own. And so we have to have these lines, I feel like, or when a student does use AI and the source is totally hallucinated, and the teacher comes and says this source doesn't exist, like it's their work. It's not, you can't just say, well, AI said that. Like that's not an excuse. Like you have to. So R stands for responsibility, for example. So I really, the other thing that I've thought a lot about is, if I'm really good at something, then why am I using AI? And I have to kind of go through this mindset. If I'm not good at something, just for example, I know basic HTML, so I might use Claude Code or something to help me get it to where I want it, and then I'll send it to my developer. But I'm going through the process of coding using AI to kind of get it to where I want it to be, but thinking, as opposed to, it used to be that I had to do it on paper, or I had to, but then I would have to like take what was in my brain and try to get it out to my developer, or get it out to my graphic designer. Whereas this AI allows me to, this kind of in between thing, but then there are things that I'm really good at that I probably shouldn't outsource to AI. So as you're thinking about this, especially across other industries, do you have other lines such, and I know you don't use LLMs at all, but what is your thought process, and how do we protect what we're good at? And then how do we protect this idea of critical thinking, and the friction in the thought process, no matter what you're good at?
That's a very good question. I was thinking when you were saying earlier about, a student having this idea or like using AI, but it's my idea, etc. That's the other thing for me, is that, we know these models are trained on existing existing content. And I feel like you cannot be sure if you're using them that you're not plagiarizing necessarily. In fact, I don't use AI in my writing, but because I write about AI, I do experiment with different models because otherwise I can't write about them. And I have a book coming out next year that's it's on a separate topic that's with Bloomsbury. It's an academic book, and I really struggled with the title of the book, and I was going back and forth with my editor on different titles, and so I was prompting different various models to try and brainstorm a title for that I was happy with since I was going through all these iterations of title. And then one of the models, like it might have been Gemini, I can't remember which one, gave me a title that was basically the title of an article I had written before, but it doesn't. So
Wow.
then I returned and responded saying that title would be probably okay for me to use because it's my title. But if somebody else used it, then I would feel that, well, that is my work. That's plagiarism. And of course, the model's response was, "Oh yes, of course, you're absolutely right." The way that they tend to do. But so I would never feel comfortable using it for any aspect of my writing for that reason, because then you also don't know. And then in the end, I didn't find it helpful at all because I just felt even using different models and prompting them to try and get different ideas for a title, I just felt like they were all just putting me in loops and sort of preventing me from thinking more expansively and more creatively. If anything, I felt like it held me back. But your comment too about what you're good at, it is it's an insightful comment because I love to write. I am passionate about it. I feel for me it feels very central to who I am as a person. That's another reason that I can't imagine outsourcing it. But yeah, you're right. I can edit in WordPress, or I can do some basic things. But yeah, there are plenty of other skills that I am not so comfortable with. So it does make me think of, okay, what about people who don't love to write the way I do, or who don't necessarily have the same craft awareness, nor do they have interest in developing that craft awareness is a trickier question. And I think probably one of the problems I had with teaching at a technical college, because my students were mostly in STEM, they wrote because they had to draft conference papers, scientific articles, but their passion was not writing. So I think that is a big difference, but still problematic because even for somebody in STEM, writing is still a process of seeing where there might be gaps in your logic, or seeing how well things actually fit together. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that it is
No,
a
I think it's just, again, this is for me one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you is this, you know, I don't would you use the term anti-AI for yourself?
um, I mean, I probably I guess I lean in that direction. I do like to think there's room for more nuance. I have a friend who is now in a school of, think of informatics, and his background is as an English professor, who's building his own model, who uses AI a lot for other things, but doesn't believe it has a place in, say, first year writing at a university. So I do think that there is some room for nuance. Yeah. But yeah, I do not use it for my own writing. So
Yeah.
yeah, anti-AI, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I probably lean in that direction because I'm so
And
concerned.
I lean pro AI is what I would say, but I think, I say a lot we should have learned lessons from social media. Like it took us way too long to understand the consequences of social media, and we're still it's the rules really have to be set in our own houses, right? Or with our own kids, and as opposed to this conversation of like, let's look at this and what it's doing to society. And I think we need to be having these conversations when it comes to AI, because it's a I say a lot. I like to use it for these sort of things, but then I have to know, okay, it's time to shut the computer because at some point I transferred my brain and I'm just letting this computer think for me, and that's it's too far, right? I need to just shut the computer and go outside or something. But it's really easy to ignore those lines. I don't know if you've seen the movie Wall-E. I talk about that a lot too of we get a choice. We get a choice if we're just going to be consumed by screens and technology, or if we're going to use them for certain things and then use the extra time to be in community and at events with each other or solving world problems. And I don't know that how we recognize that choice if we don't have conversations such as this where it's the back and forth and the nuance.
Yes, that's true, and that's also why it's a big concern if they're introducing it to young children in school. And yeah, when you're saying you're engaged with, a large language model, and then you step back and realize, oh, okay, and I'm outsourcing too much here. You and I are old enough and have enough experience that we can probably recognize that, but I'm not sure that, say, a young student necessarily has that. And that's why I do find it, I called it insidious, and I think it kind of is, because once you're even with my experience when I was engaging with these models to try and come up with a title that I was happy with for my book, I felt like it just sucked me into this loop, and it made it harder for me to see the bigger picture in some ways, and it just was I was going back and forth, basically iterations of the same sort of version rather than, again, as I said earlier, thinking more expansively. And I didn't fully realize it until I just stopped and instead started to speak with my friends who are writers or literary scholars, or just started thinking outside of that. Then I felt like I made more progress. But you don't, at least I didn't fully realize it when I'm engaging. I guess in that way, social media is a good analogy because you don't, when you're sucked in or looking at reels or scrolling through whatever platform it is, you don't completely see what's happening until you step back. I think that's probably true for most of us.
Right, right. What do
Yeah.
you think, if someone's listening to this and you want them, what would you want them to know? Like, how do we where's this the friction that happens and the tension that happens as we're thinking, as and developing critical thinking skills? What would you tell them, or just maybe think about as they're using AI?
I think that it's important, for younger people and for all of us really to be comfortable with feeling bored sometimes, because that's also very closely, there's this default mode network that, region of the brain that they found associated with creativity that is activated with active rest. So when you're doing something, going for a walk or doing something that's not task oriented, that's not responding to emails or trying to write something. And I feel like you need that space. And if people are plugged in all the time, then you don't necessarily have that. And also, I really would like people to recognize that really thinking through a complex prod or problem or whatever it is requires you to be uncomfortable to a point. And I think so those two things, feeling bored at times and also just feeling basically like this is horrible. I hate this. I don't want to, it's just uncomfortable. I don't know. Even in my own writing, sometimes I feel like this is this is nothing, this is terrible. And then you finally keep pushing through that, and then something great comes out of it often. But I think people, by nature, most of us don't want to feel uncomfortable. Why would we? And so if there's something that allows us to bypass that, whether it's scrolling through social media to avoid feelings of loneliness or whatever it is, or whether it's to bypass that feeling of I'm never going to figure this out, the inclination is to do that. And that to me is a big problem. One of my friends who is a writer too said a while ago that she said, I hate writing. I truly hate it. And I hate it until I love it. And I thought that's a good description because it is difficult and uncomfortable. And so I wish that, and even in in schools again with a young child, I try and instill that in my daughter too, because she's not on the screen very much, but I could see that if she feels bored or has some downtime, then she's always sort of angling, can I watch a clip on YouTube or can I look at the tablet? And she'll get it in very small increments of time, but I would really like to instill in her that, okay, it's okay to be bored, figure it out, like use your imagination, you don't need to be entertained at every moment. So,
Yeah, I just read this somewhere that the idea of boredom is it used to be that we just accepted boredom, that it was, you went and played outside because you were bored, or you went, maybe you did something different, but it was okay to be bored. And now it's this, let me pick up my screen because I'm bored, which is just an interesting thought. I really like what you said too of, when we're bored, or, sometimes even when I'm working out or going on a walk or something, like that's when I'll get this creative thought, and or in conversation with other people, right? Like, and the more we're on these screens, and AI is just gonna in some ways make it worse. It was interesting. I did just an introduction training for businesses. We're in this, most of the tools that we're using has some sort of AI feature now, right? And so there is an expectation for businesses to learn it, and really a responsibility as we move forward in this, because I do think we can pause it. I think I do think we need to slow down a little bit, and really kind of catch up and try to figure out what's going on and develop these lines of, this is too far for me. Or but I was doing, it was actually with an opera company, and so given that they are in arts, there was much more, I don't know, hesitation in the room, and some flat out just say, I don't want to use it. And I said, that's fine. I want you to understand what this tool is, and here's some ways. If your line is, I don't want to use it for art, or I don't want to use it for writing, you can still use it to shape a meeting agenda and go to your inbox and search for everything, that you maybe have forgotten about, or maybe there's a loose end that you haven't tied up. So you can go to, your Google Gemini or your Microsoft Copilot, and say, what are some things that I may have missed, or help me shape this agenda based on the conversations that are in my inbox. And the kind of the lights went off, or the in some of their minds, because it's like there's so much needed discussion and negativity kind of toward the using it for arts and using it for writing, but there's some common business things that can make us more productive. But I think, again, if we don't have these conversations about, here's the line I'm not willing to cross, and it can be, all those lines can be different for each of us, that we don't really, there's some other ways that it could be used for good that we're not talking about.
that's true. And actually, even, I don't use it again for any portion of my editing. And the book I have coming out next year, which is research based, was a lot of that research was done before. I was not using a lot of the research was predates the availability of large language models anyway. But I do think that that can be a legitimate use, to use them another search tool, basically, as long as you're then actually reading the sources. In fact, I did I did prompt one of the models in revising one of the chapters from my book, because I use mostly a lot of my research is in archive, like physical archives, and then obviously library databases, Google Scholar. But I do think that AI tools are efficient at search, like that they do very well is search. And I think that that is legitimate as long as, again, you are then actually going to the source and not just taking whatever the AI generated answer is. So, yeah, I guess that's why when you
That's
asked
true.
if I'm anti AI, I'm hesitant to say yes, because I do recognize that, yeah, that it has legitimate uses in those ways. I just, yeah, my again inclination is towards writing and critical thinking, and also observing the development of my young child. And when you talk about students needing to learn AI, and I think maybe some of this is, I don't know if you'd probably have a better sense of this, of whether it's now have been a movement away from all this like prompt engineering and stuff. But I always thought a lot of that seems so intuitive to me anyway, and so relatively easy to learn if you already have the strong skills as a reader and as a thinker and as a writer, you can figure that out pretty quickly later on. That's why the introduction of AI in school seems, like I do think that teaching AI literacy is really important. Like, what are these models actually doing? There was some study that showed that people who have very little understanding of what large language models are actually, like how they function, who perceive them as sort of magic, are also the ones who have the highest confidence in the results, which makes sense because if you have a better understanding of what the tools are actually doing, then you're probably going to read the results more critically, which is a good thing. It doesn't preclude using them, but you want to use them, I think, in a way that is critical and intelligent, which it sounds like you do. I guess that's why I say I'm not anti-AI. I just,
It feels like, to be honest, Victoria, when I'm teaching this, I'm teaching common sense. But so, it's just when I go over like the create framework, or even just here's how all this comes together, and I try to do it in a way. I'm not in a computer, you know, scientist or anything like that. So I'm coming at it as someone who's liked technology. I've seen how it's changing my industry very, very quickly. And so for me, it started off as, know yourself, know your business. And then if you want to use it in certain ways, know where your lines are. But again, if you haven't told AI your expertise, it's not going to speak your expertise. It's just going to give this general thought process of things that it's already learned, right? But when I'm teaching, it feels like I'm teaching common sense, but maybe that's just where we are in the world, that we have to give
yeah,
reminders of common sense.
yeah, that's possible, I guess. So do you teach things like that, like how to prompt models and how to use them?
Well, we first started, yes, and the reason is because this still exists. The models have just gotten a lot better, so they'll ask you questions if you haven't given it enough context. But when we first started, I mean, I think I taught my first class because I just was blown away, and I was like, well, people need to understand what's going on. And I'm also seeing a lot of concerns in businesses. So maybe a business does not have any approved AI tools, but their employees are still using it. And it's, again, common sense. Like if you have a policy, but you are actively disobeying that policy, like there's going to be a consequence. And it just feels like we're just, again, these basic kind of parts of business we're missing in some ways. And so there's some AI education that's happening on that front. But when prompting first started, it was people just wanted to say, okay, write a blog on this. Well, and I would say, well, that's like having an intern or assistant, and you just say, go to the store, and you don't tell them, I need this, and here is why. And then when they come in and they bought the wrong thing, you don't, you just kind of shut the door on them, or like you can't just shut the computer when you get mad at the AI. Like you need to give it more context and explain what you're doing. Otherwise, you just might as well have, told them nothing, like told the assistant or the intern or whatever, nothing. They need to know that feedback. But again, it feels like common sense when you're saying that, but it's there was this expectation of write my email and make it sound more like me. But if the AI doesn't know what you sound like, how is it supposed to sound more like you? So
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, 'cause all of that seemed always very intuitive to me, but based on what you're saying, maybe it's not to many people.
but you're right. It's I say all the time, if I can learn this and start teaching it, anybody can. But there is some, I don't know. I've always had this kind of tech brain in some ways, even though I never went to school for that. Like I feel like I get it a lot easier than a lot of people. And so, but that's probably why when I teach it, I get all kinds of, you just made this seem, every day, and I can do this. And so it's probably served me well to have kind of both sides of that brain. But it's also, there's a lot of fear right now, as there should be. But again, I think we have to have those conversations on what's scary, and is it because you don't know what it is, or because the bigger fear for me is, again, we're not having these discussions on, okay, this is too far, or we need to, if we're writing a book, we need to expect that's an actual human's writing and not AI writing. What are our society lines, and what are our personal ones?
Yeah, that
So
erosion of
anyway,
trust that you were talking about earlier and now is a big problem. And I often think that as a writer, I'm not super young. I've had time to build credibility. I have a doctorate in literature. I'm an editor for Johns Hopkins. I've published a lot. I've published a lot like pre-availability of large language models. And I often think, how is a younger writer who has fewer of these advantages or who has had less time to build credibility, how are they going to make a convincing argument that, is it just through the quality of their writing and hope that somebody will, you know, publish or pay attention? I don't know. I just think it's become a lot more difficult for a lot of people. And I do think, like you said, the everything is just flooded with AI generated content, with I may have mentioned I met somebody, and I wrote about this too at some point in my Substack about content creators and influencers. And I met somebody who she'd written somebody's very young, like she was in her mid 20s, who'd written some book on chronic illness or something, and then was just described herself as an influencer and content creator. And I know she was using, like she told me she was using AI to generate, and she was publishing very, very frequently. And I asked her on what platform, and she said all of them. And my sense was that she was just going for quantity and that she was just flooding every platform with all this AI generated content. And my impression of her was that she was very smart and probably using it in a very intelligent way. But I also found it so depressing because it was just quantity over really quality of thinking. And that I find very depressing. And the result is that we don't know what is real and what is
what
not.
is
And
real?
yeah, I find that very dismaying. And maybe that is why, as you were saying earlier, the movement towards hearing people tell stories. And I think that there's starting to be, I guess it's partly nostalgia and partly a pushback to AI, a desire for more just sort of analog things in general, that more nostalgia for typewriters or for tactile experiences and things that I do think there's some movement towards that.
Oh, I agree. There's several posts that I just love, and it's get outside and read and do things with your hands and be in community and all of these things that just seem, I don't know, like forgotten in some ways, but I think we're going to have a stronger pull to those things. And it's also, again, that yes, I might use AI to plan a trip, but at some point, when do I just ask my community, "Hey, have you been here?" And what were your favorite things and what were your favorite meals? And so it is this line. I think I mean, I know I've talked a lot about lines, and it's just I think we have to have these conversations to know, okay, yeah, I might start planning a trip using AI, but again, there's real value when I have the conversation with friends, both in getting expertise and knowledge and memories and stories, but also just the community that comes with those conversations. And we have to be really careful not to be just in front of our screens and not asking each other for that expertise.
No, I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you have a book coming out. Anything else new coming?
So I actually have a lot of projects. I have this book coming out next year that's on unrelated topic on Latin American literature and translation. And then I have a translation coming out and a translate from Spanish in a new edition. And then once those projects are close to done, they'll be published. The one it should come out in the spring of next year with Bloomsbury, and then the translation is a new edition of a book I already translated. And then, I have this Substack where I write pretty regularly on AI and critical thinking. And I have been thinking and I write on motherhood a lot. And I've only really recently, actually through conversation with a friend who's another writer, telling him I have these separate projects. I have these reflections on motherhood and I have these reflections on AI. and this friend's, why don't you make those one project? So I think that will be my next project. I've been thinking about this a lot now for, yeah, in that active rest time, when I'm taking a shower, or when I go swim laps, or I go for a walk. I've been working through all these ideas about motherhood and technology. So I think that that will be my next
Yeah.
book is,
And thank goodness. I mean, mothers can solve all of our problems. I firmly believe. And so, it's women and moms need to be in this AI conversation if we're gonna shape it at all. So I appreciate the work you're
yeah,
you're
and I
doing
feel like
there.
that's a perspective I haven't seen represented that much yet. And also a lot of the conversation about AI and also the industry is very focused on these like tech bros and like, I just think that they're, and parents, mothers, we're all thinking about this stuff all of the time and we're seeing it in our children. And I also, also we observe our children's development. I observe when my daughter learning or not to be bored, and I'm observing her linguistic development and thinking a lot about how free and creative the language of children is. And so my plan is to take these what I thought were disparate sort of reflections on creativity and motherhood and tech and make them one project where it's reflecting on things like that, like on boredom and a lot of the things we talked about today, on boredom, on the creativity, on language, on critical thinking, on human relationships, on social media and some of the social media stuff, and even say looking at YouTube and stuff, there's reflections there about profit, because my daughter, when she does, this is somewhat off the topic of AI, but if she does, I'll once in a while let her watch clips on YouTube Kids, which there's a lot of garbage on there. But at the end of the video, if they say like and subscribe, she's so little that she'll sometimes repeat that. And I'll talk to her. I don't like it when they are doing that because they're trying to sell you something. And yeah, so we have conversations too about people who use their children to put them online to earn money, like those videos, awful videos where people are just recording their kids' dance recital or whatever and putting it online. That all of that stuff creeps me out a lot. And I talked to her about that, like these, I might record your dance recital, but I'm not putting it online and trying to make money off of it. And to me, that is a big problem. So yeah, all of these things I think about all of the time as a writer and as an editor and as a former educator and as a mother also. So um,
So in the meantime, before this project book, whatever comes next, people can follow you on Substack. It's a very interesting writing. You're a beautiful writer. And again, if we start, while I believe AI has major benefits, but we can't miss out on the beauty that comes with all of us doing our strengths and our skills. And so I appreciate what you're saying about writing and not totally outsourcing all of our wonderful, beautiful thinking to a machine. So thank you for the
and I
work you're doing.
appreciate your perspective a lot too, because again, I'm very somewhat insulated for, especially from the corporate world or from marketing. I work for I'm not teaching anymore, but I still work for an academic institution, and yeah, yeah, I don't necessarily have to think in the same way about efficiency in the same to the same degree. I think that is probably true in the corporate world.
Yeah, but it's going to take us all to have these conversations. So
Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate you being on today.
Yeah, thank you so much.